Growth is a word that every economist, every policymaker, and every other decision maker is now thinking about. The IMF recently in April gave out a projection that growth will moderate for the Asia Pacific. Now, to tell us more about this, to dive deep into this, with me today is Dr. Gita Gopinath, the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us from your busy schedule here in Sri Lanka.
Pleasure.
So, Doctor, to dive deep into this question about growth and the Asia Pacific, where does the IMF see the Asia Pacific in terms of growth, given the fact there's a volatile geopolitical situation taking place, given the war in Ukraine and Russia, and now Iran and Israel, and also the reciprocal tariff saga brought about by the US?
So the Asia Pacific region has always been for us one of the sources for global growth, especially if you look at emerging markets in Asia. But the recent developments that we've seen, for instance, on tariffs and trade policy have a particularly negative effect on Asia because Asia is very exposed to global trade. In addition, as you said, there have been developments in now the Middle East. What may happen to oil prices, we'll have to wait and see. But conflicts around the world, geoeconomic fragmentation, all of that has implications for growth in the region. In April, we downgraded growth for the region to 4%. So last year growth was 4.6%. We have it at 4% for this year. But I just have to say that there's tremendous uncertainty around our numbers because the policies are constantly shifting. A lot is going to depend upon where the tariffs ultimately settle for different countries. For example, in Sri Lanka, the April 2nd proposed tariffs were very high at 44%. The question is we'll have to wait and see where it finally settles. And I know there are good negotiations going on at this moment. But again, this is a time when countries in Asia are, quite concerned about what all the trade policy implications are for their region. I think it's a good time for them to focus also on regional integration where much more can be done.
Doctor, touching on what you said, the negativity that we're seeing around the world. So do you think that this negativity will have an impact on South Asia where we will see some kind of debt distress?
South Asia specifically, if you look at the countries over here, so Sri Lanka just went through a debt restructuring, which is pretty much close to complete at this point. If I think of the other countries in the region, if you look at Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, all of them suffer kind of moderate to high risk of debt distress. So again, South Asia as a region has several countries that have elevated levels of debt. Now, this is not specific to just South Asia because if you look at the trend more globally, since 2019, debt levels have gone up everywhere because you had the pandemic, you had the energy crisis. So most countries have ended up building up debt. And growth looking ahead does not look that strong. So that's not a great place to be for many countries in the world and puts them in somewhat a vulnerable position.
Coming to Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka is in South Asia, and Sri Lanka is just now recovering slowly but gradually from an economic crisis. So how does the IMF evaluate the post-crisis era?
We see it as quite remarkable how much there has been a turnaround in the prospects for Sri Lanka. Just 2 years ago, this was a country that was in deep crisis. There were shortages of all kinds of basic necessities, including fuel and medicine. And you had inflation of 70%. Foreign exchange reserves were barely existent at that time, extremely low, huge amounts of distress for people. And in 2 years, a lot has changed. You're back to bringing growth. So growth is at 5% as opposed to negative growth rates for the last 2 years. Inflation is down from 70% to negative 0.7%. Exchange reserves are being built up. The fiscal situation is much stronger than it was 2 years ago. So we should absolutely recognize that this turnaround is impressive. Now, what is important, of course, is to stay the course. Because while the crisis of the kind that was there in 2022 is certainly subsided and it's much more stability now, it's not the end of the road. There is a lot more that needs to be undertaken in terms of constant reforms in multiple areas to make sure that Sri Lanka never ends back in a crisis like that.
Early this morning, you were speaking at the Sri Lankan Recovery Conference, Debt and Governance, and one of the points that you touched on was, is this going to be the last program for Sri Lanka? So, as the first Deputy Managing Director, do you foresee Sri Lanka needing more financing support from the IMF beyond this current program?
What Sri Lanka will and will not need depends a lot on how Sri Lanka manages these next few years of reforms. I mean, that's important. Now, we have many countries that we lend money to, and it happens once and we don't go back to them again. In the case of Sri Lanka, we've had 16 previous programs, half of which have been incomplete. And I think we can all agree, I think the President is very clear, he wants to ensure that this is the last program for Sri Lanka. But to make that happen, there has to be a clear recognition of the changes that need to be made on fiscal policy. For example, these are difficult adjustments that need to happen, but tax revenues have to be increased. They have increased substantially over the last 2 years, but that process has to continue, widening the tax base, making sure spending is well targeted, improving governance, dealing with corruption. All of that will be important to make sure there's not a reversal back to pre-crisis patterns.
Speaking of pre-crisis patterns, now once the crisis came in and when policies were introduced to mitigate this crisis, the austerity measures, the burden of these austerity measures were felt by a large amount of people in the country. What are your thoughts to those people who are probably watching this interview right now? What are your thoughts to those affected people, given that they had to carry this burden?
So I think first thing we should all recognize was that there was a major crisis 3 years ago, where you saw widespread shortages everywhere. Inflation reached 70%. The program has been critical to take the economy away from that very dark period of a crisis, so to bring inflation down. And what we do know is that inflation is very regressive. It affects poor people the most, who have to buy, they can't buy their basic food. Now, we also recognize that some of the adjustments that the program requires moving away from the pre-crisis regime where you gave lots of subsidies, because that was part of the problem. So if you want to address the root cause of the problem, you have to address what issues, for example, like what's happening with electricity, right? So one of the pieces of the program is to have cost-effective pricing, which is cost recovery pricing for energy. That obviously transfers costs to some people. It makes electricity energy consumption more expensive. But I think it's important to recognize that that is a way of fixing a fundamental problem that existed before, which is what pushed the country into a major crisis. At the same time, a lot of focus has been put on having progressive reforms, ensuring that it's not unfairly being borne by the vulnerable in society. I'll give you some examples. We put a floor on social spending. Before the program, 0.3% of GDP was on social spending. We raised that to 0.7%. So it's more than doubling the amount that needs to go to help vulnerable in society. And now for the first year, that is actually being met. And if that continues to be met on an ongoing basis, I think people will start seeing some relief. Also, the tax base has to be widened. There are too few people who pay taxes. There are too many tax exemptions. Bringing more of the people so that they're more fairly treated is going to be important. And lastly, I think people in Sri Lanka want to regain trust in the government, want to believe that anti-corruption is possible, good governance is possible. And then at least they would feel, okay, then it's okay to pay your taxes because you know it's going to be well used. So that is a change that will not happen overnight, but there is commitment to it, and it is important for the government to continue to deliver on that.
Touching on that, and my final question, Dr. Gopinath, is many argue that the IMF measures, instead of bringing recovery, is bringing more hardship to the people of Sri Lanka. So before we wind up this interview, I just want to get your thoughts on that.
I think the facts would be contrary to that, because if I look at measures like inflation, which has come down from 70% to now negative 0.7% inflation, if you look at growth, which for 2 years was negative 4% and more, was 5% last year, and we expect it to be 3.5% this year. all of those are signs of a program that's providing relief and not creating more relief. The debt restructuring that happened was also very critical to make sure that the adjustment was not very painful on Sri Lanka. But obviously everything doesn't get fixed overnight. More reforms have to be undertaken. People have to feel like their living standards are going up. I think now is when we should start focusing on recovery, on growth, on making sure that there is ease of doing business and making sure that there is good governance so that there's more investments happening in Sri Lanka, more jobs being created, and the poverty rate, which is too high at 24.5%, comes down.
Thank you, Dr. Gopinath, for joining us on News First with these wonderful insights onto Sri Lanka's economic recovery. And that's a wrap of this program with Dr. Gita Gopinath, the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund.